The morning it happened, Hazel Drummond was arguing with a coffee machine. Not metaphorically. The espresso machine at Birchwood Bistro had been making a sound like a dying radiator since Tuesday, and the Thursday lunch rush was 40 minutes away, and Hazel had already burned her wrist on the steam wand twice trying to coax it back to life. She had a small notebook tucked into her apron pocket. She kept one there always, not for orders but for things she wanted to remember. A line from a book. The way afternoon light hit the birch trees outside the window on certain October days. She'd been doing it since she was 19 and working her first summer job in Kelowna, and she'd never quite stopped. She pulled the notebook out and wrote, "Machine is being dramatic again. Like it has feelings. Maybe it does." Then she tucked it back and went to take Table 7's order. That was when she first saw him. He was already seated, wheeled himself in through the side entrance while Hazel had been crouched behind the espresso station. And he was alone at the foretop near the window, the one Hazel privately called the best table in the room, because the afternoon sun came in at just the right angle and made everything look slightly more cinematic than it was. He was maybe 40, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark wool sweater that probably cost more than Hazel's monthly rent. His name, she would learn later, was Callum Ashby. He ran Ashby Capital out of an office tower in downtown Calgary, and was worth, by various estimates, somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 million. None of that was visible sitting there. What was visible was that he was alone, and that he kept checking his phone with the particular careful expression of someone trying to look unbothered. Hazel went over with her order pad. "Hi there. Just yourself this afternoon? Or are you waiting for someone?" he said. Then, glancing at his watch, "She should be here." Hazel nodded, set a menu in front of him, and went to check on her other tables. She had 6 covers that afternoon. It was a Wednesday, which was always oddly busy at Birchwood, some confluence of the farmers' market across the street and a yoga studio around the corner, whose noon class always let out ravenous. The woman arrived 11 minutes later. Her name was Vanessa, and Hazel could tell from the way she scanned the room, dismissive, unhurried, the gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating spaces and finding them adequately or inadequately worthy, that this was a blind date and that it was not going particularly well for Callum Ashby before it had even begun. Vanessa saw him. She stopped. Not in the way people sometimes stop when they're surprised or moved. She stopped the way a person stops when they've just realized a package they ordered is the wrong size, and they're calculating how much of an inconvenience the return will be. She walked over anyway. Hazel was 2 tables away, refilling water glasses, and she heard the beginning of the conversation because Vanessa did not lower her voice. "You didn't mention the wheelchair." A beat of silence. "I didn't think it was relevant," Callum said. His voice was even. "Practiced, maybe. It's relevant to me." Vanessa set her purse on the table but didn't sit. "I'm sorry, I should have been clearer with Diane about what I was looking for. This was a waste of both our time." She picked her purse back up. She left. She didn't raise her voice. She wasn't cruel in any theatrical way. That almost made it worse. The brisk, businesslike efficiency of it, as if she'd simply encountered a clerical error and corrected it. The restaurant had gone very quiet. Not silent, the espresso machine was still dying noisily in the background. And someone at table 3 was telling a story about their brother-in-law, but the particular quality of sound in a room when people are pretending not to have witnessed something. Hazel knew that sound. She'd grown up with a father who had a progressive tremor, and she knew exactly what it sounded like when strangers decided not to look. She walked to table 7. Callum Ashby was looking out the window. He had both hands flat on the table. The menu was open and he wasn't reading it. "I'm going to recommend the butternut squash soup," Hazel said, as if nothing had occurred. "The chef makes the stock from scratch on Wednesdays and it's genuinely ridiculous how good it is. And if you want something heavier, the bison burger is the best thing we serve. That's not on the menu, it's a special, so you'd only know if I told you." He turned from the window and looked at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "The soup, though, genuinely ridiculous." Something in his expression shifted. Not a smile exactly. More like the particular realignment of someone's face when they decide, against reasonable expectations, to be present instead of gone. "The soup," he said. "And water. Coming right up." Hazel put the order in and went back to her other tables and did not make a thing of it, which she understood instinctively was the correct approach. Her manager, a tightly wound man named Gary, who kept a spreadsheet of customer complaints sorted by severity, came over at one point and said something quietly to her near the hostess stand. She shook her head. He shrugged and went back to the office. When she brought the soup out, Callum was writing something on his phone. He set it face down when she approached. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Sure. Do you always narrate your menu recommendations like a nature documentary? Hazel thought about it. I think the soup deserved it. This time he did smile. It was a good one, slightly crooked, arrived slowly. Callum Ashby, he said, and extended his hand. Hazel Drummond, she shook it. I'd stay and chat, but I have a table of 4 who've been trying to flag me down for 6 minutes and I value my tip. She left him laughing. She thought about that afternoon more than once over the following weeks, which surprised her. She thought about it the same way she thought about certain sentences in books, returning to them not because they were unfinished, but because they had some quality that rewarded revisiting. She wrote a few words about it in her notebook, the way a person looks when they decide to stay. She didn't expect to see him again. He came back the following Wednesday, same table, same time. He ordered the bison burger he hadn't ordered the week before, and when Hazel brought it out, he said, "You were right about the soup last week. I thought about it on the drive back to Calgary. It's a 4-hour drive," she said. "Long time to think about soup," he agreed. She had 6 tables again. She didn't have time to linger, and she didn't, but somewhere between the lunch rush and the mid-afternoon lull, she found herself aware of him in the peripheral way she was aware of certain things. The way the afternoon light came through the birch trees, the temperature of a room, specific and hard to explain. He left a tip that was more than the meal cost. She didn't know what to do with that, so she split it with the kitchen, which felt right. The 3rd Wednesday, he brought a book. She recognized it. A novel by a Canadian author she'd read twice, the kind of book that shows up in the homes of people who actually read rather than people who have books as decor. She almost said something and stopped herself, and then at the end of his meal she said simply, "The ending surprised me the first time and made complete sense the second." He looked up from the page. "You've read it?" "Twice." He turned the book over and read the back as if reconsidering it. "I'm about halfway. Don't tell me." "I won't," she said. She was smiling when she went back to the kitchen, and Dara, the line cook who had been at Birchwood for 7 years and had, in Hazel's estimation, missed her calling as a therapist, said, "What's that about?" Hazel said Dara received with the particular expression of someone who has decided to wait. He came back the 4th week, and the 5th. On the 6th Wednesday, the restaurant was quiet. A cold snap had kept people home, and there was no reasonable excuse not to talk. Hazel pulled up a chair at the end of his table and sat down with her own cup of coffee, and they talked for 40 minutes about the book he'd now finished, and then about other books, and then about Kelowna and Calgary and a camping trip he'd taken to Cape Breton 5 years ago that he still talked about the way people talk about places that rearranged something in them. She learned that he'd been in the wheelchair for 6 years, a spinal injury from a skiing accident that had come at the exact midpoint of his life, he said, and had reorganized everything that came after. He said it the way people say things they've made peace with. Not easily, but honestly. She told him about her father. The tremor that had started when she was 12 and progressed slowly, the way her family had rearranged itself around it without ever discussing the rearranging, the way she'd gotten very good at noticing what people needed before they had to ask. "Is that why you work here?" he said. "I work here because I dropped out of a graphic design program at 22 and needed rent money," she said. "I stayed because I actually like it." "The soup," he said. "The soup," she agreed. He asked for her number when he left. She wrote it in the small notebook first, a reflex, and then copied it onto a Birchwood business card and gave it to him. That night she wrote, "Callum Ashby called himself a reorganized person. I've been thinking about that." They met for dinner in Calgary 2 weeks later, at a restaurant he'd chosen specifically because he'd called ahead to confirm accessibility, which he mentioned only because she asked, and which told her something about him. She wore the blue dress that had been hanging in her closet for a year, waiting for an occasion that felt worth it. It was worth it. His mother, however, was another matter. Catherine Ashby was 71 years old and had the particular energy of a woman who had spent decades being effortlessly formidable and saw no reason to stop. She ran a philanthropic foundation out of Calgary, sat on 3 hospital boards, and had, according to Callum, strong opinions about everything from federal housing policy to the appropriate thread count of linen. She'd raised Callum and his younger sister alone after their father died when Callum was 14, and she loved her son with a ferocity that occasionally looked, from the outside, like control. Hazel met her for the first time at a family dinner in November, 8 weeks after the Wednesday at Birchwood. Catherine shook her hand with the measured warmth of someone reserving judgment, and spent a good portion of the evening asking questions that were polite on their surface and pointed underneath. Where had Hazel gone to school? What had she studied? Was she still waitressing, or was there a plan? Hazel answered everything directly and honestly, which she suspected was both the right strategy and mildly unexpected. Catherine had likely prepared for defensiveness. Honesty was harder to dismiss. Still, driving back to Birchwood that night, she'd moved there 3 years ago, rented a little house with a yellow door on the edge of town. Hazel thought about the way Catherine had looked at her, not unkindly, but the way a person looks at a variable they haven't yet solved. Callum called the next morning. "She liked you," he said. "She's deciding whether to like me," Hazel said. A pause. "That's fair," he said. "She decides slowly. She decided about me for about 30 years, and I think she's still not finished." Hazel laughed and wrote in her notebook, "He makes me laugh without trying." December was the good part. They fell into the kind of rhythm that happens when two people are well matched and both old enough to know it. Weekends alternating between Birchwood and Calgary, long phone calls on Tuesday nights, the particular ease of someone you can be quiet around. He came to Birchwood for Christmas Eve and met her father, who shook his hand carefully and then said to Hazel, in the kitchen while the kettle boiled, "He looks at you like you're a fixed point." She wrote that down too. Catherine remained pleasant and unresolved. In January, Hazel was offered a position. It came from a man named Robert Slade, who ran a boutique hotel group with properties in Banff and Whistler, and was the kind of business acquaintance Callum had dozens of, not exactly friends, more the ambient network of people who circulated in the same financial atmosphere. Slade had been to Birchwood twice for lunch during the fall and had apparently noted Hazel's approach to service with the particular attention of someone who thought about things professionally. The offer was guest experience director for the Banff property, starting in March. A real salary, benefits, her own small team. It was a good offer. She knew it was a good offer. She also knew, immediately and uncomfortably, that Robert Slade was looking at her with an interest that did not feel entirely professional. Not overtly. He was too careful for that. But there was a quality to his attention, a certain persistence to his eye contact, that she'd encountered before and recognized the way you recognize weather. She thanked him and said she'd think about it. She thought about it. She declined. She wrote a brief, professional email and thanked him for the opportunity, and said she'd decided to stay where she was for now. She did not explain why, because the why was partly about Callum, and partly about the quality of Slade's attention, and partly about something harder to name. A feeling she had, very strongly, about what it would mean to say yes. 2 days later, Slade called Gary. Hazel wasn't there when it happened, but she pieced it together afterward from what Gary told her and what he didn't tell her, from his expression and his word choices and the particular way he looked at the space slightly to the left of her face. Slade had said something. She didn't know exactly what. Gary was careful, or maybe just conflict-averse, but whatever it was, it landed in the category of professional damage. Something about her attitude, her reliability, her suitability for the industry. It was the kind of call that left an invisible mark, the kind you couldn't argue against because nothing explicit had been said. Gary let her go at the end of the week. "Budget restructuring," he said. She saw in his face that he wasn't proud of it. She drove home to the house with the yellow door and sat in the kitchen for a long time. She called her father. She did not cry, which surprised her, and then she understood that she wasn't surprised. She was angry, which was different and in some ways more useful. She did not call Callum that night. She sat with it first because she'd always believed that the things you choose to share with someone and when you choose to share them are their own kind of information about who you are. She called him the next morning. He listened. He was very quiet while she talked, which she recognized as the quiet of someone paying genuine attention rather than assembling a response. When she was done, he said, "What do you need right now?" She said, "I need you not to do anything." A pause. "Okay, I mean it. I hear you," he said. And then, "I'm also very angry. So am I," she said. "But I get to decide what happens next." She believed him mostly, though she could hear the effort it took. She spent 3 weeks applying to positions, rewriting her resume, calling 2 friends from the Kelowna days who had remained in the industry and who gave her references with a warmth that steadied her. In the 4th week, she was hired as assistant food and beverage manager at a lodge outside Canmore that was exactly the right size and exactly the right distance from Calgary and from Birchwood, and whose chef, a compact, exacting woman named Faye, who had worked in kitchens in Ottawa and Halifax and once very briefly in Lyon, made a butternut squash stock from scratch every Thursday and didn't understand why anyone wouldn't. Hazel started in March. Slade, she learned later, through the ambient network, the way information travels in industries that are smaller than they appear, had developed a reputation that had begun to catch up with him. One woman, and then another. A formal complaint to the Hotel Association in February, the Whistler property quietly listed for sale in the spring, Hazel wrote in her notebook. Sometimes the story answers for itself. You don't have to be the one holding the pen. The thing with Catherine resolved itself not in one moment but in several small ones. Hazel noticed the shift first in March, at a dinner where Catherine asked about the new job with an interest that seemed for the first time genuinely curious rather than evaluative. And then in April, when Catherine called Hazel directly, not through Callum, to ask for a recommendation for a restaurant in Canmore where she was meeting a bored colleague. Hazel spent 20 minutes on the phone with her, going through options, and at the end Catherine said, "You know, you have a very good sense of what people actually need. I've noticed that about you." Hazel thanked her. After the call, she sat for a moment and thought about the word noticed. It was a word Catherine would choose carefully. The proposal happened in September on Cape Breton Island, at the end of a road that dead-ended at a cliff above the ocean. Callum had planned it with the careful, detailed attention he gave to things that mattered, which Hazel recognized as a love language and appreciated accordingly. He'd had the ring designed by a jeweler in Halifax, a small oval stone in a plain gold setting, which was exactly right, which meant he'd been paying attention. She said yes without deliberating, which was its own kind of answer. They were married the following June at a small inn outside Birchwood, 27 people, the kind of wedding where everyone actually knows each other and the food is genuinely good. The soup was on the menu. Dara drove 3 hours from her new kitchen in Edmonton to make it. Catherine gave a toast that was brief and direct and expressed in the particular language of a woman who rarely says more than she means, something close to joy. She had held Hazel's hands before the ceremony in the small room they'd been given for getting ready, and had looked at her for a moment with an expression that was different from everything before it. Unguarded, honest, something Hazel thought she might write about, but found she didn't need to. She said, "I'm glad he found you, and I'm glad you didn't make it easy." Hazel laughed. "I wasn't trying to be difficult." "I know," Catherine said. "That's what I mean." Callum fainted at the 8-week ultrasound. Not all the way down. He caught himself on the edge of the bed, but enough that the technician, a very composed woman who had clearly seen this before, said in the tone of someone who was trying not to smile, "That happens more often than you'd think," and handed him a juice box from somewhere Hazel hadn't noticed a juice box could be stored. Hazel lay on the table with the ultrasound wand on her stomach and looked at her husband, the man who had sat at a restaurant table alone on a Wednesday afternoon and decided, against all good reason, to stay, and felt the specific, overwhelming weight of a life that had accumulated itself quietly, detail by detail, until it was suddenly this. She pulled out her notebook. The technician watched her write something and raised an eyebrow. "Sorry," Hazel said. "Habit." She'd written, "He's still here. He's always still here." The small heart on the monitor flickered steadily, and outside the window the October light was doing exactly what October light does, and Callum, juice box in hand, was looking at his wife with the expression of a man who understood, at last, that some things cannot be planned or optimized or managed, only received.